I'm going to be moving through some information that happens before chapter 42, just to kind of catch you up. It's some of the things that you actually saw in that little trailer that was there. But we're going to go with the timeline again. You know, assuming the world is only 6,000 years old, creation took place around 4,000 BC. The flood occurred around 2344 BC. Or if you want to do it backwards, it was 1,656 years after creation. God flooded the earth and destroyed all life except for Noah and his sons, Noah and his wife, and his sons and their wives, and then the animals that had been gathered by the hand of God to go onto the ark. Abram leaves for Canaan somewhere around 2091 BC. Now, I got to correct that because last week I think I put up there that it was Abraham's birth was 2091. It was actually like it was 21 something, and I'll get that to you. But he leaves for Canaan about that time. The birth of Isaac takes place 2066 BC. Jacob and Esau are born. Remember we talked about them last week. They're born 2006 BC, and then Joseph is born around 1915 BC. And so we're going to share this morning Joseph's story. And I'm going to back up to Jacob, basically Jacob, and talk a little bit about what happened with Laban. I mean, not really talk about it, but refer to it. Remember, Jacob was a deceiver, and he went to his father-in-law, or he became his father-in-law. It was his mother's brother, Laban. And he goes there, and while he's there, he meets this young lady named Rachel, and he just loves her. I mean, from the very beginning, he loves her. And so he says to Laban, I'll work 7 years for you. And after the 7 years, then Rachel can become my wife. And Laban agrees. Only Rachel had an older sister named Leah. And just put it this way, Leah wasn't the best looking girl. And so he'd been having trouble giving her away because no one wanted to take her. And so what happens is on the night of his wedding, he goes in and his bride is veiled and it's dark. And so he lays with her. And the next morning he discovers that it's Leah. And he's ticked. So he goes back to Laban and he says, well, you know, what's going on here? And he says, well, we have a custom here that the oldest daughter has to be given away, and then they go in order, and Rachel is next. But here's the deal. If you'll work another 7 years for her, then after this week, I will give Rachel to you as your wife as well. And so he agrees, and then he kind of, you know, deals with Laban in a different way, a backhanded way, a deceiving way. And so when Jacob and Rachel and Leah leave there, they have a lot of wealth. They have the best of the flock. They have the best of the stock. They have the best of everything when they leave. And just a side note, you'll have to read about this, but they even steal, not Jacob, but Rachel steals Laban's household gods, which was a big deal. And so, anyway, while they're in all of this time there, Leah begins to have children. Now, here's the deal. I didn't mention this last week, but what you will notice with both Abram, Isaac, and Jacob is that the wives that they have, the ones that they desire, are barren. God has, and here's why I think that is in there. They are barren. They cannot have children. I think it's in there because God is going to prove to them that he can do anything. And so basically Leah has the first four boys. And I mean, Rachel is really upset because she can't have children. And so she says, hey, take my maidservant Bilhah and lay with her. Does that sound familiar? Because, you know, Sarai did the same thing. You know, I can't have children, so lay with my maidservant. It's kind of a family thing, I guess. And so she says, lay with Bilhah, and so he does. And then Leah stops having children, and so she says, if Rachel can give him her maidservant, I can give him my maidservant too. And so she says, lay with Zilpah. And so Jacob lays with Bilhah and Zilpah, and I know they're weird names, but and then they begin to have children. And so kids 5, 6, 7, and 8 come from Bilhah and Zilpah. Okay? Or is it Zilpah? It's Zilpah. Sorry. Zilpah. I love you, Zilpah. Yeah. So the next 4 children come from the maidservants. Well, then God is gracious, and actually, sons 9 and 10 are back with Leah. Leah has some other children. And so by this time, Rachel is Jacob too. And then God blesses them. He blesses them. Rachel finally gives birth to 2 sons. Their names are Joseph and Benjamin. And they're probably, there's other brothers who are pretty great. Judah, for one. Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, the Lion of Judah. And so, Judah is one of the great tribes. But Joseph and Benjamin end up being, pretty important people. Well, here's the thing. Rachel dies while giving birth to Benjamin. And so what happens is that means that, Jacob has lost Rachel, the one that he originally wanted to marry, the one that he loved dearly. He loses Rachel, and so those 2 boys become his favorites. And, after watching years of Dr. Phil, can you see how that can happen? Seriously, you look at it and you can see how that would happen. Those 2 boys become his favorites, and especially Joseph. And here's the thing. He makes him an ornate robe. That's what the Scripture says. Now, I don't know how we've taken it and said, the coat of many colors, or the Technicolor dream coat. How many of you have seen that, actually? All right. Yeah, it's great. It does a great job with this story, but I don't know who decided to call it the Technicolor dream coat or the coat of many colors, because the Scripture simply says it was an ornate robe. But here's what I know about it. Here's what I know about that ornate robe. It got him beat up, probably a lot, especially by his brothers, because his brothers hated him. And that, that tends to happen in a family too, doesn't it? When there is a favorite. If there's a favorite, then there's a problem, because the favorite begins to be the center of everything, and that includes the center of his siblings or her siblings' frustration. And so they take it out on him. It's no wonder that Joseph doesn't hang out with them. But one day he's sent out, He's sent out to them to find them, and he finally tracks them down. And the thing is, that opportunity wasn't just about him being the favorite. It was also because Joseph, he had been blessed with having these dreams. And the dreams were pretty cool, to dream about how the people of the world, and that includes his family, are going to bow down, and they're going to not worship him so much, but they're going to praise him. They're going to honor him by this bowing down. And he goes and tells his brothers. Now here's the thing. That's great information to have, but it's not always such great information to share, especially with guys that hate you in the first place. And so some of them want to kill Joseph, but the oldest brother, Reuben, suggested that they put him in a dry cistern. And the thing is about Reuben wasn't just going to leave him there. Reuben's plan was to come back and to get him and take him home. Big brother wanted to protect his little brother, even though he didn't like him. And so while Reuben was away, and it doesn't say where he went. It says when Reuben got back, so that means he was away. So while he was away, the others sold Joseph to some Ishmaelites. Now, that's important there. It's just Ishmaelites. What it's proving is that not only has not only has Isaac started to produce generations, but Ishmael has too. And by the way, all this stuff, this is just a note for you, all the stuff that's going on in the Middle East, they're Ishmaelites. They're descendants of Ishmael. And you know what God said way back here in the book of Genesis about Ishmael? You know, he will be a mule of a man, and he will fight. And he will fight even among his brothers. Have you noticed that that's what's going on? You know, that's part of the reason that the Bible is so reliable. When things like that come true, and it's coming true today. I mean, that's what's going on over there. What God has said. They're never going to get along. They're always going to be fighting. If they can't find an outside source to fight with, like us, or Great Britain, or, you know, no, France won't fight. I'm sorry. But if they can't find an outside source, they just decide we're going to fight amongst ourselves. And so he's sold to some Ishmaelites. Now, once they get to Egypt, he's sold again, and this time he's sold to the captain of the Pharaoh's guards. His name is Potiphar. And it says in the scripture that God blessed Joseph during this time. But here's the thing, God is not the only one who shows favor to Joseph. Potiphar's wife does too. I mean, his wife says, come and lay with me. I want to come back to that. His wife says, come lay with me. And over and over again, I mean, we just got one little picture of it in the promo there. But over and over again, every day she says, come and lay with me. You know, and finally, he says to her, listen, I mean, in fact, let's look at it. Look, turn to Genesis 39, verses 8 and 9. These are some great verses right here about our battle with sin, about who it's against. And so there in chapter 39, verse 8, it says he refused. He says, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house. No one is greater in this house than I am. And he goes on and he says, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now, I hope that you notice there that what he's doing, he credits everything in the house to his master Potiphar. And then what he says is, beside Potiphar, I am the next in line. You know? He's saying I have a position of authority, yes. But I don't have any right to any of his possessions. Now, you got to remember how women were treated. And so what he's saying, and it's even deeper than that. It's not just about his wife being a possession, okay? Because I hope you see it. He says, everything in the house, and I'm in charge of everything except you. I can't. I mean, he's given me open reign with everything else, okay? But you, and that's because you are his wife. His wife. And so he credits everything in the house to his master Potiphar, including his wife. And then he says, when it comes to the sin of adultery, he will not dishonor God. Now, Chuck Sackett was my preaching professor. And he has a great line from this a message that he did about this. And I want to show that to you. And then I'm going to leave it there for just a little bit in case you want to write it down. And I would encourage you to write it down, because this is good stuff, okay? And so on Genesis 39:9, where he says, when it comes to this wicked thing, I will not sin against God, Chuck Sackett says, just this little brief aside, that is where morality finds its strength. We do or we don't not sin because we might hurt our neighbor's feelings or we might hurt our spouse's feelings. That may be true, but our ultimate decision about life is what honors God and what keeps us from sinning against Him. Listen, you want to change the way that you do things? Start understanding that God sees every part of it. He knows. There's nothing that you keep secret from anyone else that He doesn't know. And that it hurts Him. It hurts Him. And so our morality finds its strength in knowing that our sin is not against another person. I mean, we have to deal with those relationships here, but our sin is actually against Him. And the reason that our sin is against Him is because He's the one who set the standard. He's the one who says it's wrong. You know, I get people all the time who come in and they try to justify their affair. Or they try to justify, you know, their wrath on somebody else. They try to justify their hatred for someone. They try to justify a broken relationship. It happens all the time, and it's even happened with me. I mean, I'm going to tell you that. It's happened with me. It happens with all of us. We all share that. We all do that stuff on Sunday morning sometimes. You know, and so understand that sin is against God, and it's because He's the one who sets the standard for us. He sets the bar. So now, Potiphar's wife forces herself upon Joseph, and Joseph runs right out of his coat. The Apostle Paul would be pleased with him because the Apostle Paul says this. He says that you flee from sexual sin. You flee from it. Guys, that means when it pops up on your computer screen. I mean, listen, maybe you're just watching worship videos on YouTube. I was watching a song last night that I wanted to hear, and it was a worship song, but the ad that came on before it was about another artist from, you know, hip-hop, and there were girls in it, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy who wrote this worship song, this guy who is doing this worship song, I bet he's not very pleased that the commercial before is this. And it was also one of those that you can't click out of after 5 seconds. And so what you got to do is just turn your chair until it's over. Divert your eyes until that Victoria's Secret commercial is over. Because here's what I've learned, guys, husbands, here's what I've learned is that you cannot understand what watching another woman, another figure, does to your spouse. You can't. And so he runs right out of his coat, and then she screams, rape. And so he's arrested. He's put in a jail. And while he's in jail, he meets these two guys, the cupbearer and the baker, I think. He meets the cupbearer and the baker. And they have these dreams, and they come to him and say, man, we had some weird dreams last night. And so he says, well, tell them to me because my God can interpret them. And so he tells them, or they tell them, and one of them gets good news. This means that your head will be lifted up and you will be placed back into service with the Pharaoh. And the other one gets bad news. He says, your head will be lifted off and placed out so the birds can eat the flesh from your face, your head. And so one of them gets good news, one of them gets bad news. And so he goes in then, well, he asks them as they're leaving. And I can realize why the baker doesn't say something. The baker probably doesn't like what he just told him. But the cupbearer, he said to him, remember me before Pharaoh. And he doesn't. And so 2 years goes by. When that said perseverance, 2 years went by. But even in that time, it says that God was blessing Joseph while he was there in that prison. And finally, Pharaoh had a dream. Now, his dream was about skinny cows and fat cows and stalks of grain that were eating other stalks of grain, and these fat cows were eating the skinny cows, the skinny cows were eating the fat cows. And so he doesn't know what it means, and nobody else knows what it means. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer says, hey, I know a guy that can tell you what it means. He's in prison. And so they go down and they get him. And there's a key thing there. It says that they shaved him. The Egyptians would shave their head and their faces in a certain way. And so in order to be presentable before Pharaoh, he had to be shaved. And it says that they shaved him. And so he goes before Pharaoh. And he says to Pharaoh, what's the dream? Pharaoh tells him the dream and says, can you interpret it? And he says, no. But my God can tell you the meaning. And so finally he comes back and he tells him the meaning. And that actually brings us to our story here. The meaning of the dream was that there were going to be 7 years coming up that were plentiful. These 7 years would produce crops like you haven't produced before. But following that 7 years, there were going to be 7 years of famine and drought. And during that time, nothing was going to be produced. And so the dream was, if you're not careful, the years of famine are going to completely consume the years of plenty. And so Joseph begins to, because of that, Pharaoh elevates him. He's just told him the meaning of the dream. And he has this God who can share and tell anything. And so Pharaoh elevates him to second in command over Egypt. You imagine that? From the prison to the White House. Yeah, we can imagine that, can't we? I wish it was the other way around. Mary just said. Sometimes I wish that. From the prison to the White House he goes. And so he's in control of everything. And what he does is he manages everything. All of the resources of Egypt he begins to manage. And you got to know this. It's by God's direction that he does it. It's not by his power. It's what God has made him for. And so he begins to manage all of this stuff. And that brings us to our text. Genesis 42, 1 through 7. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? I love that. I'm bored. He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin. Remember, Joseph makes the 11th and Benjamin is the 12th. So he sends the other 10. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. I want to read verse 8 too. It says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now, how is that possible? Because Joseph was young. We change, as we go through high school and we get just a little older. It's possible. By this time, you need to know, 20 years has probably passed. And so while he still recognizes his brothers who were adults back then, they don't recognize him, especially because he's been prepared in the Egyptian look, the Egyptian hairstyle. Real quickly, I'll say this. I went to get my hair cut the other day. There's a new guy, and his name is Reuben. And Reuben works up here. I'm just a free advertisement for him because I'm telling you, I like the haircuts that he gives. And you can, actually, I'll tell you, I'll do this. You can ask me where he works afterwards, okay? But Reuben was cutting my hair. And I like Reuben because he uses the straight razor. You remember when guys used to do that? around the edges, they use the straight razor so that it's sharp, you know. And I mean, and so when I left there, he had my hair like swirled back here, you know. And I walk in the church, and Robbie goes, I kind of like it. I'm like, no. And then he says, but that's the way everybody's wearing it today. All of the preachers, that's what he said. All of the preachers are starting to wear their hair that way. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do that then. I want to be a trendsetter, not a... So anyway, getting back to the story, you know, everybody's wearing it that way. Well, that was the Egyptian look. And so they don't recognize him. I mean, they just don't. And so now here's what I'll say about this. A dream is fulfilled in verse 6. I mean, catch that, because Joseph's brothers bowed down before him. You know, and actually, not even an honor. It was just simply, it was just respect. Okay? But they bowed down before him. You know? And then I want you to notice Joseph's reaction. You know, Joseph, you know, the first thing I would ask is, why didn't he reveal himself at that time? And honestly, the answer is he's probably hesitant to trust them. You know, they thought that he was gone, and now he's coming back. What's going to happen? And he probably also had other things in mind. I mean, like seeing his younger brother again, like seeing Jacob, his father, again. And so that was probably all on his mind. One major requirement for trust is time. Man, there are people who need to hear that today. There are spouses that need to hear that today. The thing that will help your trust, I mean, when you've broken trust with another person, the only thing that will help it is time. Because what they need to do is they need to learn to trust you again. I mean, they do. They just need to learn to trust you again. And it takes some time. And again, I deal with this all the time. Couples who come in and, you know, one of them is like, well, I know I did this and it was a terrible thing that I did, but she just won't trust me. And I said, well, how long's it been? 2 months. And I'm talking like a major thing, you know, fling or texting with another woman. You know, that kind of stuff. Well, no, texting with another man in that case. It's the wife. No, it's the guy. I was right. I'm sorry. So he says, it's not such, you know, I don't understand why she doesn't trust me. Well, and I want to do this sometimes, and I'm sorry, folks, but it's like, you know, when you repeat yourself so often, and again, take encouragement in that, because if we have to repeat things over and over again, it means that everybody has dealt with it. Everybody is dealing with it. And so there's times, though, I want to go, you moron, it's been 2 months. You want to know what it's going to take? It's going to take 6 months. It's going to take a year. And then she'll begin to trust you. And so just kind of hang on to that, because that's one of the major teaching points in this. It takes time to trust again. All right, so now Genesis 42, 9 through 24. And I'm going to read it kind of quickly, but although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and that you may not die. This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, surely we were being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you? There's always somebody, right? Reuben says, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Now, why Simeon? Didn't I tell you Reuben's the oldest? Why isn't it Reuben? That's what most cultures would have done. They'd have taken the oldest or the youngest. Why Simeon? Because Simeon is next in line. He's the second born. And Joseph has just heard Reuben say, didn't I tell you not to harm him? But you wouldn't listen to me. And so he's not going to keep Reuben. He takes Simeon and he bounds him. Now here's what he does, and it kind of tests them. I want to make a quick note about it, though. Notice the brothers' remorse in it. Even they were remorseful. This God's dealing with us because of what we did. We saw his distress. See, that's key. When someone notes that they hurt someone else or they scared someone else, then you know that they're feeling some sort of regret. And it's not just because they got caught, you know. And so he says, didn't we see his distress? And so the brothers' remorse. And now what I want to give you is a little bit of story time. That's what I'll call it, simply because this stuff is going to direct us through. So all but Simeon go back to Canaan. Joseph places their silver that they'd brought back in their sacks. Now, that's part of his plan. He wants to demonstrate that they are not honest men, because he wants to be able to catch them and hold them, and at some point deal with them however it is that they demonstrate themselves. And so Joseph places their silver back in their sacks. They discover that, by the way, on the way home, at least in one of the sacks. And they are, could you imagine? Seriously, they'd be like, what? What's going on? And so they tell Jacob what this man requires. They tell him everything that he requires. That he wants Benjamin to come back with them to prove that they are, honest men, and that they keep their word. Jacob refuses to send them back with Ben. And the only reason I didn't put Benjamin is because it would have placed it on the next line. All right? And so they refuse to go back, or he refuses to send them back with Ben. In fact, there's kind of a cool verse there. He basically says, you've deprived me of my children, my sons. He says, Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And there's no way that I'm sending Benjamin to him. That's how Jacob was. But here's the thing. As the story time continues, things change when you're desperate. When you get to chapter 43, it says, yes, the famine was still severe in the land. So things change when you're desperate. Basically what happens is they get hungry. And so Jacob says, you guys need to go back up there again. And they say to him, listen, he said, bring Benjamin. We cannot go back without Benjamin. He'll kill us. He'll treat us like we're spies. And so Jacob agrees to send Benjamin along. And he also tells them to take special gifts, gather all these special gifts, and pack their sacks with them. And 2 times the silver. In other words, he's take the silver you were supposed to buy, leave the first time, and make sure you leave the 2 bags each with him. Make sure he gets it. When they arrive, Joseph orders a feast, He has an animal slaughtered and says we're going to eat at noon. And they're a little suspicious of this. First he's accusing them of spies, now he's holding the dinner. And so basically they think that he's scheming to kill them. And so one of the servants says, no, this is directed by God. I mean, it's one of Joseph's servants. So do you think Joseph is telling people about his God? Yeah, I think so. And so one of the servants says, no, this is the thing. God blessed you with that. Now, as they leave, Joseph has a silver cup hidden in Benjamin's pack. He takes their silver, but he has a silver cup that's hidden in Benjamin's pack. And so what that forces them to do, we'll look in 44:14. They returned to the city because of that silver cup. And Joseph was still in the house, verse 14 says, when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. Joseph said to them, what is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? What can we say to my Lord? By the way, he doesn't do divination. He's just throwing them off. Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? What can we say to my Lord? Judah replied. What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup. But Joseph said, far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace. And then Judah went up to him and said, please, my Lord, let your servant speak a word to my Lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servants, do you have a father or a brother? And we answered, we have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. He says, then you said to your servant, bring him down to me so I can see him for myself. And we said to the Lord, the boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves, his father will die. But you told your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my Lord had said. Then our father said, go back and buy a little more food. But we said, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us, we will go. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father, and I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame for you, my father, all my life. Now then, please, let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his father. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father. Now, I read that because what you need to understand is that Judah is a picture of Christ. He's willing to step in. He's willing to save his younger brother and also, not put his father in that state of misery and grief. And so Judah is a picture of Christ. It's a pointing, if you will, towards where Jesus will come from. He will come from the tribe of Judah. God gives us these hints all throughout here, all throughout the Old Testament. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, let me speed forward because, I'm quickly running out of time. My goodness. Second service, I can't share the tangents, okay? But You have to bear them, and I'm sorry to our Sunday school teachers. I do this to you all the time. Again, notice his brother's remorse. Notice the attitude of forgiveness that Joseph displays. Notice Judah's attitude as well, willing to take the place of his brother. God's hand is clearly seen in this story. Can you all agree with that? That God is guiding all of this. He's directing this. Now, why can't we accept that he's that involved with us? Don't we say we worship the same God? He's the same from yesterday, today, and forever? And yet there are people who all the time just, he doesn't work in me. No, you're not watching. You're not looking. You need to say, take me, mold me, use me, fill me. You need to say, Lord, let me see with your eyes. Can I tell you a little Holy Spirit thing here? We didn't have a discussion about any of this, did we, Mike? But those songs that he chose are perfect for this message. Because we need to be a people who become willing to see with Christ's eyes, willing to hear with his ears, willing to love with his heart. And that means that we have to accept that he's that involved with us. Or wants to be. How many of you have ongoing feuds with someone? Because that's what this is. And I know it might be really fresh for somebody. And I get this all the time. Somebody comes up and they'll go, I know you were talking about me. Well, I'm glad you know that because I wasn't. I got my own feuds to deal with. And what that should read is how many of us have ongoing feuds. Are we willing to make it right, forgive, and move on? Are we willing to do that, or are we going to dig in our heels like so many other people do? And even church folk. I've been to churches. I'm not saying it's here, but I have been to churches where you walk in and you understand that there's a feud right here in this church. These people over here all are getting along, and they wouldn't have done your meet and greet. It had been, preacher. No way I'm talking to them. You know what they did to me back in 1939? And so it happens to everybody. God is alive. He's active. We need to pay more attention to what God is trying to do in our lives. Maybe those awkward encounters, and we all have them, maybe those awkward encounters are not just chance meetings. Maybe God's trying to put you in a place to heal things. We've had it. There was a couple who left this church, and we had hard feelings at the time. And since then, we run into them everywhere. And at first it was like, don't go down that aisle. But then we were in church one night in Champaign. Jennifer and I were there. And I'm telling you, I also have, I know people, listen, we're going to go a little long. If you haven't. I have panic attacks. People don't know that about me, and you know where it happens? Right out there. When I'm sitting right out there. And I know what it is. Part of it's because I'm in a position where I'm not in control. And so that's where it happens. And so we're sitting in the middle because we want to hear the music real well. We want to, hear everything real good. So we're sitting in the middle, and this poor couple behind us. One of the things that happens is I started sweating. I'm not doing anything, and so I'm just sweating. It's like this cold sweat that's coming over me. And I know what's happening. I'm having a panic attack. And so they did a meet and greet. We turned around and said hi, and then we left those seats. That poor couple was like, let me smell your breath. They had to be thinking that. And so, anyway, we go over to the back corner of this auditorium. We sat down, and I looked down, and there is that couple. Jennifer elbowed me and goes, and I went, But we're in church, right? So we're going to put on that smile. And when they turned around, we waved, and they waved. And I think that their wave was a little more exuberant than ours was. And I found out why, because a few weeks later, Jennifer runs into him. And they come over and they give her a hug. And his wife says to Jennifer, everything's good. Everything's good. You know what that... I mean, right now I just got cold chills. Because I know it's good. I don't have to feel awkward anymore. You know? And so maybe those awkward, they're not by chance. God is putting us there to say, hey, everything's good. You know? And so, you know, may we all, you know, I believe that God still directs our steps, including our appointments as believers. We have to return to recognizing His divine hand at work. You know, we're not going to read these verses. You can read them later. But what happens there is they're reunited because of all this. Joseph comes into them and he breaks down and he says, I am your brother. I'm still alive. And of course, all through this, they still don't trust him. In fact, clear down to the last chapter in Genesis 50, we see that they still don't trust him. But God works in these mysterious ways. Egypt is used to protect and grow a nation. And that's only a foreshadowing of the protection to another Joseph, his wife, Mary, and son, Jesus. And hang on to this quote, too. Many have said the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. Another Joseph goes to Egypt with his wife, Mary, and his baby, Jesus, and they're protected. The Old Testament points towards Jesus and his life. Even these things could be said to be prophecies about who he will be. And so, that's why we study it. You know, that was their proof in the first century church. They were able to go to those Old Testament scriptures and point to Jesus. This was Jesus. This was a model of Jesus. This guy was giving an example like Jesus. And so it points to him, so we need to study it. God is alive and active. My prayer is that we're aware God is using us. I mean, there are going to be tough and difficult times, but God is still in control. Amen? Genesis 50:20. This is where they've still come to Joseph. Jacob's died by this time. And they come to Joseph and they say, you know, they're still afraid of him. And Joseph says, listen, you intended to harm me, but God intended this for good. It's what he's been telling them all along. He's been telling them, God brought me here to protect you, to protect us. And it reminds me so much of a passage that Paul has, Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.